All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As another reminder, you are being recorded. Welcome to the ASCE, EWRI, and AFS-BES Joint Committee on Fisheries Engineering and Science free webinar series in today's talk. My name is Kathy Hoverman, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This is our first webinar of 2022. And we are very excited for today's speaker. Before we get to that, I do have a few announcements. We have been recording several of these presentations lately. You can review any one you saw or perhaps missed by viewing them on our YouTube site. I'm going to drop in chat right now our website in which you can get to the YouTube showings of them. So check that out and listen in to some of our past speakers and some of the great information that they shared. Also on the website, there are job opportunities and other community announcements. And you can also have your job announcements or opportunities posted on there as well. I'm going to drop in an email address for Rachel in which you contact her, and she will be happy to post that on our website. The next webinar that we will be having will be in May, and it will be on the infrastructure bill. I know everybody's super excited about all the money coming down out of that, and let's get some great projects in the ground with it. But that webinar will be facilitated. It'll be more of a panel discussion. That'll be facilitated by the Fish and Wildlife Service National Fish Passage Program. And more details will be forthcoming and announced through our normal chains. So however you normally see it, it'll come that way as well. All right. I think that's all my announcements. Specific to today, you are to use the chat function. So there's a little chit chat box. Go ahead and drop any questions that you might have into the chat box. We won't stop our presenter for questions mid-presentation. We'll wait till the very end, but feel free to start loading those up earlier on, and then I'll be asking those questions to him when he's all done. So as for today, I know everyone's super excited. Dr. Daniel Zielinski, he's a principal engineer and scientist at the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. Dan received his BS in civil engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and an MS and PhD from the University of Minnesota with an emphasis in water resources. He has authored numerous publications examining behavioral responses of fish to acoustic and hydrodynamic stimuli and the integration of this data into numerical models. All that to say he's super smart. That's why we call him Doctor. He's currently stationed in Traverse City, Michigan, where he works closely with the FishPass project partners to oversee the construction of FishPass, develop research and assessment plans supporting FishPass objectives, and communicate with stakeholders. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and excited to hear your talk. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Dan Zielinski. I'm Principal Engineer and Scientist with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and the lead on the FishPass project in Traverse City, Michigan. What you'll see here today is the culmination of nearly 6 years, actually probably more than 6 years, but at least that I've been involved, 6 years of planning, which has included contributions from over 100 biologists, engineers, all with expertise in fish passage, invasive species control, and civil engineering. I'd also like to acknowledge our project partners that are shown. Their logos are all shown on the bottom of the title page here, and also our primary funders, which include the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Great Lakes Fishery Trust, State of Michigan, City of Traverse City, and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So today I'll start by briefly introducing the concept of the connectivity conundrum and how it's facing management decisions on barriers and fragmented watersheds locally and around the world. Then I'll discuss how this is playing out on one specific system, the Boardman Ottaway River in Michigan, and how an innovative project, or FishPass, seeks to solve these ongoing issues by developing tools to selectively pass desirable fish species while blocking and or removing undesirable and often invasive species. As I'm sure most of you are aware, connectivity within rivers and between rivers and their receiving waters is critical for many life history traits of fish and general watershed health. Barriers in the form of dams or road crossings block connectivity in a system. This is a global issue as nearly 60% of all rivers contain at least one large dam. In the Great Lakes alone, a network of nearly 250,000 barriers on tributaries affect the movement of an estimated 121 fishes known to show migratory movements between lakes and rivers or within a river. While removal of fish passage barriers is a recognizable solution, restoring full connectivity can have both desirable and undesirable consequences, hence the connectivity conundrum. This is especially true at sites where barriers block invasive species. Now, there are numerous invasive species in the Great Lakes, but arguably none have had more devastating impacts on the fishery than sea lamprey, which is an invasive species that's originally native to the Atlantic Ocean. Sea lamprey gained access to the Great Lakes in the early 19th century, and due to their devastating feeding habits, contributed to the collapse of lake trout and lake whitefish populations. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission was formed in response to the fishery collapse, and one of the GLFC's major roles is to manage and coordinate a sea lamprey control program, a program that targets sea lamprey early life stages and reproduction. Sea lamprey parasitize fish out in the Great Lakes and move into tributaries to spawn, where their larvae can stay for 3 to 10 years. So the control program uses two main tools to be able to control sea lamprey. And the first is lampricides, which are mostly species-specific chemicals that are applied to tributaries to kill sea lamprey larvae. The other tool are barriers, which are used to block sea lamprey from reaching spawning habitats in those tributaries, thus reducing the amount of lampricides needed for treatment. However, the barriers that block sea lamprey also block most native fish in the Great Lakes from reaching that same high-quality spawning habitat. In the Great Lakes alone, there's over 1,000 lowermost barriers, that being the barrier that is the first barrier in a system between the Great Lakes and its tributary. Now, combined, lampricides and barriers have reduced sea lamprey populations to over 90% of the historic peak. So it's been effective, but it does have some consequences for native species. This leads us to the connectivity conundrum, where we try to manage the alternate management strategies of barrier removal for increased connectivity and barriers for invasive species control. We aim to solve this connectivity conundrum through selective connectivity. In other words, we want to develop the ability to pass desirable species while blocking and/or removing undesirable species. The challenge of selective fish passage is fundamentally one of sorting an assortment of things. But sorting systems for live organisms without manual intervention don't really exist. And for this reason, we developed an approach to selective fish passage that integrates fish ecology and biology with engineering, which will be implemented at FishPass, an adaptive fish sorting facility on the Boardman Ottaway River in Traverse City, Michigan. Now, just to familiarize yourselves with the project site, the Boardman River is located in northwest Lower Peninsula of Michigan and drains into Lake Michigan near Traverse City. Now, prior to the inception of FishPass, the Boardman River was the focus of a multi-year, multi-agency restoration project that removed 3 upstream dams and sought to modify the lowermost dam, Union Street Dam, for selective fish passage. Now, the images shown at the bottom illustrate the varying levels of dam removal that have occurred since 2012. The image on the right is the former Brown Bridge Dam site. You can even see the relic embankment. In the middle is the former Boardman Dam site. And what's interesting about this site was that bridge was actually built over land that did not have water flowing underneath it. And it wasn't until they removed the dam and restored the channel back to its kind of relic location was there actually water under that bridge. And on the left is, a picture of the Sabin Dam being actively removed. Now, these dam removals greatly improve the habitat and connectivity in the Boardman River, but it leaves the system vulnerable to sea lamprey access, which led to partnering with the GLFC to implement the FishPass project at Union Street Dam. In this sense, we essentially had a solution for a problem, and we're looking for a site to be able to develop it at. Now, in this next clip, which hopefully the audio will work for you all, we'll give you a pretty good idea of how much the system has changed and the issues FishPass hopes to solve, as well as introducing some of our local partners in the project.
It wasn't too long ago that I didn't have to struggle through those aspen to get down here to the river to fish. After the Brown Bridge Dam removal, it was essentially a brown, stump-strewn, non-vegetated wasteland. It amazes me Mother Earth has a way of filling in those ecological niches. But that's just part of the recent history that's happened here as a result of the Ottaway River Restoration Project.
So we're stuck in this dilemma because we were able to take a river that we've worked so diligently to reconnect and undo much of the negative influences that were done to this river in the past 150, 200 years. But the dilemma comes in where this river is connected to a Great Lake where we have this invasive species who would love to turn all that river into spawning habitat. And we don't want to create additional habitat for this invasive species. And that's where the conundrum of Union Street comes in.
So the term we like to use here is the connectivity conundrum. So this is weighing the alternative management options of removing a dam to restore connectivity, but that can have some unintended consequences, meaning passage of invasive species or contaminants that were trapped either upstream or prevented from reaching upstream because of the dams were in place. Or you want to maintain the genetic stock of a fish population upstream from those that are hatchery raised downstream.
So the conundrum becomes, what do we do with Union Street?
So as mentioned, the last remaining barrier in the system is the Union Street Dam. It's an aging structure that has limited ability to block passage of undesirable species. The existing fish ladder you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, which has been closed since the upstream dams were removed, historically could only pass introduced salmonids and the occasional sea lamprey. And with the upstream barriers now removed, this is the only thing that's stopping those species from being able to gain access. So the ultimate goal of the whole river restoration is to enhance connectivity between the Boardman Ottaway River and Lake Michigan, a goal that will only be possible through developments at FishPass, a project that will bring remarkable changes to the Union Street Dam and its surrounding space. At FishPass, we'll essentially replace the Union Street Dam with an improved barrier with selective fish passage capabilities, optimize various sorting technologies below a barrier, develop the site into a living laboratory aimed at fostering both academic research and community learning. And finally, after a 10-year optimization phase, be able to convert the site into a permanent selective fishway and then begin exporting the process to other barriers. Now in this rendering, this kind of highlights many of the main features that are included in FishPass. I'm just going to highlight, because there's a lot there, I'm only going to highlight just a handful of ones that are relevant to the rest of my talk, but that focuses on the fish sorting channel. So that's at the lower portion of the stream, or lower portion of the image. It's the long linear channel. This is the primary site of research at FishPass. This is a 30-foot long, 400-foot long concrete lined flume. It is designed for adaptability in mind. It has a removable partition so we can split the channel into two 15-foot wide channels or leave it open as a 30-foot wide channel. There's multiple anchor points installed throughout so that we can rapidly install or move around different sensors or sorting technologies. And that is also aided by a gantry crane that can also traverse the whole length of the channel. We can rapidly collect environmental data with an automated data carriage that will be able to move sensors around the channel so we can get measurements that are accurate. And flow is controlled throughout the whole system through a combination of almost 13 head gates and tailwater gates so that we can manipulate flows within the channel so that we have the required depth and velocities that are required while still maintaining a barrier at the upstream end. On the other side of the channel is the nature-like bypass channel. So this is a more naturalized channel. It has vegetated banks and more natural design aesthetics similar to the restored stream sections that are located upstream of the site. This is designed to primarily convey normal river flows, recreational use, as well as all the flood capacity for the site. And controlling flow into this channel is a combination of low flow weir, which is a small 20-foot notch to provide a constant flow into the bypass channel, and then also a labyrinth weir, which is able to provide the flood capacity for the site while doing so safely. This bifurcated channel permits essentially the dual recreational and research use of the river. It's located in downtown of a very popular vacation destination, so being able to accommodate both uses was very key in the design of the project. And of course, there's a lot of additional landscape and infrastructure modifications that are done to the site, but I won't get into a lot of those details here. But as you can imagine, FishPass is not just a large science project. It includes, it does provide environmental, recreational, educational, and economic value to the community, improving the quality of life for local residents in many ways. These include, but are not limited to, improved stormwater management through the decrease of impermeable space, inclusion of rain gardens and a green roof system. It'll enhance the in-stream fish habitat in the form of riffle run segments, an engineered log jam, and over an additional 500 feet of vegetated riverbanks compared to the existing conditions. And then, most importantly, for recreational use and just pedestrian use, is enhancing universal access to the shoreline and river with educational opportunities. Now, a lot of these features were not done or decided upon by our group of engineers or biologists, but early and often communication with the public was what garnered a lot of the additional aspects of the project. So these collaborative discussions between project partners and public consultation really did help inform the primary elements of FishPass. And briefly, some of those are, as I'm sure you can surmise, like aesthetically, the community really valued a naturalized landscape design and protections for water quality. Biologically, the project goal is essentially to prevent sea lamprey reproduction so that no lampricides are required upstream of the dam, and also the improvement of Boardman River fish productivity. Recreationally, the community, there was a need to provide community desired outdoor recreation amenities like fishing access, kayak launches. So we have ADA accessible kayak launches and just improved movement of boats from upstream to downstream. And then socially, it's really just to promote engagement regarding broad objectives for the Boardman River and invasive species management. And of course, this project really would not be possible without the guidance of our advisory board, whose membership is formed from all of our project partners, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, as well as a science team that consists of approximately 20 researchers and management agency staff with expertise in fish passage, invasive species control, and engineering. The role of our advisory board is essentially to guide FishPass operations, management, and our research. So moving on to slide 12 here, I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the design and biological aspects of FishPass. And first, I'll discuss how the new structure is first and foremost an improved barrier compared to the existing condition. Now, this may seem a bit counterintuitive for a fish passage project, but controlled and selective passage is really not possible if unintended passage can occur. So obviously, prevention and uncontrolled passage of fish was one of our major design criteria. This is a concern as if sea lamprey passage did occur, it would require routine and expensive lampricide treatments to eradicate sea lamprey from the upstream watershed. And there's also the fact that the community has mixed concerns over the passage of non-native steelhead into the system. So therefore, for the initial 10-year optimization phase of FishPass, we intend to be able to block steelhead, which, as I'm sure many of you can imagine, is a significant challenge. So a detailed analysis was conducted to be able to define the operational constraints for fish sorting channeled gate operation, estimate the relative risk of uncontrolled passage based on historic flows, and also establish hydraulic thresholds to trigger additional monitoring. So risk analysis of passage of both sea lamprey and steelhead was conducted. For sea lamprey, this included HEC-RAS modeling and computational fluid dynamics modeling to be able to evaluate when conditions would meet to block sea lamprey passage, which is maintaining a 18-inch or 45-centimeter vertical differential from the crest of any water conveyance structure to its downstream tailwater level. And it was a little different for steelhead passage because, of course, they have strong jumping abilities. So we used a projectile motion analysis to evaluate all potential leaping angles and leaping origins to find out whether they could pass under different historic flood conditions. And this required CFD modeling to be able to calculate both velocity and depth at the origin of any possible leaping attempt. And I won't go into a lot of the details here, but CFD results basically of each potential pathway were analyzed at different flood conditions to identify levels of protection for the facility. Essentially, we wanted to find out what is the risk of passage for a given flood event, and what would we need to do to trigger for additional monitoring. And when we look across the results to comparing with historic flood conditions at the site, we see that sea lamprey are predicted to be blocked up to a 100-year flood, which is above and beyond most purpose-built sea lamprey barriers, which are typically around a 25-year flood interval. Steelhead are expected to be blocked up to a 25-year flood, but there is a small chance at lower flood conditions, so we are instituting a increased monitoring at about the 5-year flood level, and this will include some video-based monitoring to be able to detect when fish are jumping in and identify if any make it actually over any of the barriers. So now that we're confident we can achieve controlled passage, we switch gears now to FishPass operation. FishPass was designed for flexibility in accommodating different sorting methods and tools, as well as different routes for fish encounters. And this, as I mentioned before, is made possible through manipulating the 13 head gates. We have the removable center partition and 2 tailwater control gates. Our normal operation condition is shown here. So you have water being able to pass from the upstream end to the downstream end of the fish sorting channel, which is at the top of the screen. The image at the top kind of shows the ideal passageway for fish to move up into the system. It's designed to maintain at least 3 feet of water depth at no greater than 3 feet per second velocities. This figure demonstrates, the anticipated flow vectors through the site in this base operation. And while I don't have it shown here, normal operation also includes conditions where flow is through just one side of the fish sorting channel, either the north or south side. We also have an alternate operation condition which reverses flow down one side of the fish sorting channel and up the south section of the fish sorting channel, so that the water actually exits at the upstream end of the Nature Lake bypass channel, as you can see from the velocity contours. And really this was implemented in the design so that we can increase our ability to promote fish entry into the fish sorting channel and also interactions with the sorting tools. We are currently planning a movement study for the first year of operation so that we can understand the baseline movement patterns and behaviors of fish before we do start trying to sort. So now once fish actually get into the fish sorting channel, we have developed a framework for approaching technology selection and configuration that's inspired by material recycling. Now this may seem like a very strange analogy, but if you think about it, material recycling is really a process in which you just try to collect a mixture of items and sort out desirable materials. And surprisingly enough, the processes and innovations developed by the material recycling sector actually provide useful guidance and lessons learned for the development and implementation of selective fish passage. Even its development has analogies to the rise of selective connectivity. If you think back to recycling starting to kind of come to be, it was really in response to raised environmental awareness, which is very similar to the current climate in which communities are acknowledging that barriers can be detrimental to fish passage, and barrier removal becomes a common response, but there are some detrimental effects. So it's very similar in that sense. Some of the early drawbacks in material recycling was that it has high cost because manual trap and sort or manual sorting of materials is very labor intensive. But technological advances were really key in being able to move towards what's called a single stream recycling process. You know, if you think back, very early on, material recycling required, you know, people at their home separating materials out into separate bins, which got picked up or had to be brought into separate facilities for repurposing. What single stream recycling did was it allowed people to just combine and commingle all their materials into one box. It get picked up, brought to a central facility that then is able to parse out all the materials all at once. So you reduce the amount of, you know, kind of pre-sorting that's required. And that's something we strive for with selective fish passage. But porting single stream recycling processes and innovations to selective fish passage still requires an approach where understanding the ecology and biology of targeted fish and ecosystem needs to be integrated with engineering designs from the onset. Because unlike material recycling, fish have behaviors and volition. They can respond to things, whereas material is inert and can be pushed around much easier. And this obviously does provide some more opportunity in selective fish passage, but also some complications. So you'll be seeing this slide a few more times here, but essentially what I want to do is kind of step through the recycling process and its analogies to fish passage. And primarily they both have 4 sequential stages. For recycling, it's collection, disintegration, conditioning, sorting, and fate. And you should all be relatively familiar with the stages of fish passage, which is approach, entry, sorting or passage, and fate. Now note the top image is just a diagram of a generic recycling process where material is directed to a material recovery facility, while the bottom is a conceptual diagram of the fish passage facility, which has been designed to facilitate testing of selective fish passage technologies. And for reference, water flows from right to left, and the chop channel is outfitted with a suite of sorting technologies. And essentially the barrier, so the labyrinth weir, is impassable otherwise. So looking at the first step of collection and approach, you know, both material recycling and fish passage have history with manual sorting. However, the difference is material recycling has moved past that. Manual sorting of materials is really uncommon at this point, especially in single stream recycling phases. But one of the things that is really key from the material recycling industry is the ongoing assessment of incoming objects. It helps prepare the sorting facility to adapt to changes in material composition. And this is similar to the need to evaluate the life history and phenology of fish moving into a given system. So if you have, you know, because as I'm sure you're all aware, you're not going to have all fish trying to migrate into a system all at the same time. They're not going to be present at the same time. So you don't need to try to sort through every possible species all at the same time. You can gear it towards what's available. Obviously, collection in material recycling requires packer trucks, and I know trucking fish for passage does occur. We're not necessarily saying that, but in this sense, you know, the river acts as an analogy for the packer trucks, delivering fish to a sorting point. And this is also during the approach phase is also a starting point for some potential long-range guidance or deterrence methodology, you know, potentially using like pheromones to attract fish to a certain river. Moving on to the second step, which is disintegration and conditioning, or entry. For better or worse, fish congregate near fishway entrances, much like how a packer truck would pile waste onto a tipping floor of a recycling facility. Now, one of the benefits of this is it does at least eliminate the issue of trying to pass fish across really large spatial domains. But some of the takeaways from the recycling industry is at this stage, this is where they'd start to remove large or bulky items and try to homogenize the particle size to help improve sorting. Now, I'm not promoting the disintegration of fish for purposes of passage here, but the idea of first sorting fish by size does have some validity. You know, for example, if you have technologies that are sized to handle sea lamprey or suckers or walleye, you know, these are smaller species. They're unlikely to be able to handle larger species like a coho salmon or a lake sturgeon. So being able to remove those really large individuals that are easily identified for passage or blockage right away does help improve your efficiency in being able to sort those smaller species. Here, it's also important to acknowledge that the recycling industry also introduces the concept of conditioning. So it's essentially changing or enhancing an object attribute to better facilitate sorting. So one of the ways that they do this in material recycling is you cut up large items. So you make things smaller so that, like paper particles, you can use blasts of air to separate that out from heavier materials. Now, you couldn't do that if those objects were still really large and you could have large materials sitting on top of them. This is a concept that could really be realized in fish passage for targeting fish behavior. Now, while it's still unclear how effective this might be in practice, conditioning for fish passage would really seek to alter those context-dependent behaviors to induce potential self-sorting, or at least increase the predictability of responses to future stimuli. So it's really how multiple stimuli might increase or at least increase the predictability of how fish will respond down the road. The third step is the primary sorting stage. And this is a critical aspect. The critical aspect of this stage is the integration of multiple technologies in series or parallel configurations to reach a desired efficacy. Sorting, especially at a very simple level, follows a simple process train with distinct steps targeting single attributes of the material. I'll get more onto the attributes on the next slide, but these processes can be either positive or negative. Positive meaning you're targeting your desirable material or desirable fish, versus targeting your negative sorting is targeting your undesirable material or fish. And this is key for situations where the proportion of desirable to undesirable fish fluctuates. Hence you can imagine it's going to be easier to remove a few undesirable fish from a group of mostly desirable fish than the alternative. Sorting processes can also be direct, meaning they actively separate fish or materials. So you can imagine a screen actively separates fish based on size, or they can be indirect, in which the object is identified by one technology or process and then moved using another. An example of this in fish sorting would be using image recognition to identify a fish, and then that would trigger a door or a gate to open that allows passage or blocks passage. And really the key aspect to effective sorting is both the selection and configuration of multiple technologies. And there are some frameworks available from the recycling industry that could be applied here, like Bayesian modeling, but I'm not going to get into that detail today. Honestly, when we look at what are the potential attribute-based sorting technologies we have available for fish passage, the options are actually surprisingly vast. These technologies focus on targeting a specific attributes of fish, including their phenology, so their run timing, what species are available, do they move during the day versus night, those types of things. Morphology. This is sorting fish based on their size or shape. Behavior, their response to environmental cues. So whether you provide sound, light, or different types of turbulence conditions, does that influence their movement? And then, of course, physiology. What are they capable of overcoming, whether it be a velocity challenge or a jumping challenge, or the ability to swim out of the water through an eel-style ladder. These are all opportunities. And most of these technologies have been tested for a number of years, typically at small scales and independently on single species. And what's really key with FishPass, and what I think is its greatest attribute, is the fact that this is the first opportunity where you can really integrate a lot of these technologies. And it's that integration that is expected to yield the biggest improvements to selective fish passage. So here's a brief animation that just shows a hypothetical scenario of how this is envisioned for FishPass. So here we start by sorting fish potentially by size, which is a logical first step from the single stream recycling example. It's tough to deal with both large and small fish. Then, through an indirect method, you could identify fish based on their shape or color, use image recognition as a potential tool, sort fish based on their swimming or leaping ability, and then perhaps their response to environmental cues like sound, bubbles, turbulence, or light. Also separate fish based on their preference for swimming at different depths in the water column. And then using traps to be able to filter out both desirable and undesirable fish. So that's an example of just very high level of what we anticipate a potential sorting process would look like at FishPass. Now, an example of a new technology that might be ready when FishPass opens is an optical sorting tool. We've done some early research working with Whoosh Innovations to use their scanner, and working with researchers at Central Michigan University, we've been able to develop a computer learning algorithm that's able to identify sea lamprey from an assortment of other Great Lakes fishes with an accuracy exceeding 99%. Now, this high accuracy was achieved because you're able to image fish out of the water. And we're now looking at research using a fairly old technology like an Archimedes screw to be able to lift fish up continuously into the scanner for identification and then directed for passage or removal. Now, research is still ongoing with this, and this is just one method, one tool that's available for us at FishPass, because obviously there's questions about, how many fish this can actually handle at a time. But you can imagine image-based recognition is going to be really key when we want to make sure that we minimize the number of undesirable fish that could potentially be passed. And now we move on to the last phase, which is fate. This is fairly similar across both recycling and selective fish passage. And this is the final stage of the process that examines both the rate of passage and the composition. In fish, the key aspect here is that passage occurs quickly and leaves fish with adequate fitness so they can complete their life history. So when we look at some of the expectations for selective connectivity in fish passage, the success is really going to be goal dependent. And that needs to be set at the outset of a project. What level of selectivity is required? For sites with sea lamprey, it's pretty strict in that no passage of sea lamprey can really be permitted. But how that impacts passage of native species is then up to your goals that you set at the outset. But other sites, it may be admissible to have, say 10% passage of undesirable species if you're able to pass large quantities of your desirable species. So again, it's going to be goal dependent. Efforts and goals then also must be tied to those broader conservation goals. As I mentioned before, simply passing a fish upstream doesn't necessarily mean it's going to contribute to the fish reproduction in that system, because there's other factors that can play a role. So being able to identify what those conservation goals are, whether it's restoring energy and nutrient cycles, increasing productivity, increasing sustainability of fish species, just simply preserving biodiversity, or restoring genetic connectivity, or simply managing invasive species. And the way we intend to develop this at FishPass and should be at other sites is that it's developed within an adaptive management framework so that it allows for the planned incremental advancements and modifications in operations. Single stream recycling was not developed overnight, so it's not reasonable to expect that selective fish passage is going to be solved rapidly. But learning from those lessons and acknowledging the fact that we do have a large toolbox of single attribute sorting technologies available, this provides us a very good chance to succeed. Now, I'm going to conclude with just a brief overview of some of the ongoing assessment activities that are occurring in the Boardman River in support of FishPass. And the purpose of these activities is to provide fishery managers the information needed to evaluate the effectiveness of selective fish passage at FishPass, and to help adaptively determine which species to pass and in what numbers to meet the fish community goals, as I just mentioned. Recognizing these directives, our assessment plan details how ongoing work under two main priorities. The first being the overarching goal of developing and implementing selective fish passage in order to solve the connectivity conundrum by evaluating specific characteristics at the site, such as fish movement behavior, abiotic associations of that behavior, and eventually the sorting efficacy of apparatus installed at FishPass. The second priority of our assessment plan is to understand the consequences of restoring connectivity to the system. Here we're working in the context of where do these fish go after passage? What is their ecological fate? And how does their passage affect upstream communities and ecosystem dynamics? So in the fall of 2018, we started work on fish movement in support of FishPass. So prior to the site being constructed, we used we started off with using radio and pit telemetry. The map on your screen represents the locations of these systems with the blue circles and green squares. These are the locations in which we are monitoring presence of tagged fish. This system provides us with a method to be able to evaluate how fish approach, enter, and pass or are blocked in respect to features of interest, which include the Boardman River as a whole at the river mouth, or Kidd's Creek, which is the only tributary that's located downstream of FishPass, as well as encounter at the fish passage site. We're also in the process of expanding the telemetry network to include acoustic telemetry. The system shown here takes advantage of other ongoing projects to amass large-scale coverage of the bay, receiving fish from the Boardman River. This system also taps into the GLaDOS network, so we can determine where Boardman River fish go beyond just the Grand Traverse Bay and the Boardman River. This system allows us essentially to look into where the resource pools are that migrants that are moving to and from the Boardman River are reaching. And this array also includes multiple receivers that are now being placed upstream of the site. So essentially where this project is, as I mentioned, this is six plus years in the planning. So that's the final engineering design of this was completed in early 2020. It went out for bid through the Army Corps of Engineers and a contractor was selected in late 2020. Due to some ongoing litigation against the city by a private citizen, the project's essentially been on hold, and we're hopeful that the legal holdup will conclude early this year and we can start construction later this year. And we anticipate a 2-year construction phase to get the site up and running, in which we will start a commissioning phase in either late 2024 or early 2025, with research on selective passage ensuing the following year. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Dan. That was amazing. I assume you've got a pretty big team of folks that came together to develop this project. You have is it like 10 people, 50 people? To give us an idea, how many people worked on this project to bring all the kind of the thoughts? I mean, there's just so much that has gone into that fish sorting. And I'm just also wondering if there's been a moment of, we should have included that in it now that you're kind of a couple years into just thoughts about it before it gets built.
Yeah, so the team that contributed to the design criteria for the site and the actual engineering design and getting us to where we're at now, we held 3 initial kind of planning meetings, which each one had probably 50 to 60 contributors at each. So I think in total that was just, we're nearing 100 engineers, biologists from US, Canada. We had some from Europe that all participated. So that was really great. But when I tallied up through, the whole design process, that number gets north of probably 200 people have been involved in one shape or another, versus rather it be, permitting, design, just construction administration. It's a large group, and I'm just here to kind of show the nice results of it. It's a very much a team project. And in terms of aspects that we wish had been incorporated, every time our advisory board meets and we go over new aspects of, all right, this is what we're going to look at during that commissioning phase, the new things come up pretty readily. And we try to address those and be as open for future modifications. But I mean, really, the site was meant to be adapted to whatever site conditions and fish and tools are going to be included. So it's while it's a full engineering design, it's still very, very flexible. So as we come up with concepts that, we need to include that, we're trying to anticipate those as much as possible.
Great. That's Always keep innovating, right? All right, we've got a couple questions that are coming in. First one is a comment, and we'll let you respond to this comment. This all seems very intensive technological approach. It only takes one person using lamprey as bait to release them upstream and defeat the system. Thoughts?
Yes, that's a potential at pretty much any sea lamprey barrier. Like I said, there's 1,000 lowermost barriers across the Great Lakes that are all susceptible to that same type of passage. But evidence shows that maintaining these systems does control their population. So it's not something that we can't necessarily address specifically at FishPass, but being able to continue with the community engagement so that people are aware of the risks that are posed by moving fish that way, that can be addressed in that manner. But it's not unique to FishPass. It's not unique to any barrier across the basin. That's always a possibility, sadly.
Right on. Okay, you have a ballpark estimate of the capital cost to create this in a river, the money to do all the assessment work, and the ongoing O&M costs once operational. And they're just trying to figure out whether we are talking about several million, tens of million, hundreds of millions, or where are we looking at money-wise?
Yeah, so just the design and construction of FishPass. So the construction contract was awarded at roughly $19 million, with most of that funding coming from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. In terms of O&M, we do have a good idea of those costs. Again, you're not going to have a nail on that until the site is operational. But the Great Lakes Fishery Commission has also bolstered up our operations costs so that we have it staffed for the 10-year research phase that it's planned for. But I want to preface all that with it's not our intent that this site needs to be replicated at all other barriers. This is a fairly unique situation, but it's the idea of what we want to export out of this is the process to identify what tools to use and how to configure them so that more specific solutions can be applied to other sites. So we aren't necessarily saying you have to have a 400-foot long channel at every single barrier, because that's obviously very unreasonable. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. It's the process that's developed here is what we want to export, not necessarily FishPass itself.
Okay. All right. Another question: how are down migrating juvenile sea lamprey that are attached to fish and end up getting an unwanted ride back upstream? Feel like there might be a word missing in that question. And then it finishes with, if a desirable species gets through FishPass, it might have a juvenile attached, and then what? So I think we get the gist of the question there. What's your thoughts on that, Dan?
So some of that is with the lamprey biology. If they are feeding, so they're parasitizing fish, they are not capable of reproducing. So once sea lamprey don't mature until they're already made that migratory movement to try and spawn, and at that point they've ceased to feed. So just biologically, those occurrences are relatively low, although it does happen. You'll have a steelhead that has a sea lamprey attached, try to go over a barrier. That it does happen. It's a very low occurrence, but if you think about the risk of it is not as great as, say, a lamprey that has ceased to feed and is actively trying to migrate upstream to reproduce. So it's a low risk, but there can't say it would never happen. But that's why having some image-based recognition could potentially help identify some of that.
All right, so you mentioned sea lamprey and steelhead as target species for exclusion. Are there other species targeted for exclusion, and what are some of the target species for passage?
So on this site, the species for exclusion are obviously sea lamprey and steelhead. There are other introduced salmonids into the system. Coho and Chinook do make regular runs into the system, but there's a DNR operated weir downstream of the site that they put in the fall to collect those fish. So they're excluded, but through a separate process. In terms of fish we're trying to pass, certainly trying to restore a natural run of lake sturgeon into the river is an ideal goal. Obviously, I'll bet a very long-term goal. We have instances where we actually were able to tag one individual this year that made its way into the system that has been blocked off from for nearly 150 years. Otherwise, other species include walleye, white sucker, long-nosed sucker. Those two species alone in the spring, round up into the probably tens of thousands of fish that enter the system that have been blocked. There's also lake trout entering the system in the winter, lake whitefish, brook trout, brown trout, pretty much any species that's native to the upper Great Lakes and is migratory in this system. We're aiming to pass as many of those as we possibly can.
Great. Is the biodiversity sufficient in the Ottaway River to be testing ground for all or most tributaries in the Great Lakes?
I mean, it's relatively typical of a lot of these systems because it does have a drowned river mouth lake just upstream, so it does have a population of kind of warm water species in that system, and then further upstream you get into high quality brook trout habitat. There's a brown trout population there. In general, I think there's probably, I want to say we've confirmed at least 36 species located up and downstream of the site. So it's a relatively biodiverse situation, but acknowledging the fact that every site is going to be unique, and that's where, like the case of steelhead, although they're aimed to be excluded out of this site, other sites, that's not an issue. So again, putting everything into context for the Boardman River and other sites is going to be important.
All right, we keep getting more and more questions. So you've stirred a lot of thoughts in people. This is great. All right, you noted modeling to prevent steelhead passage. How were the results of the modeling incorporated into the barrier design?
So the design was set up using some relatively rudimentary HEC-RAS modeling, but during the engineering phase, our engineering design firm used CFD modeling to specifically look at water levels across the site. And they used essentially, they were focused primarily on just maximizing the vertical differential as the basis for the design. And once the full design was completed, those same CFD models were then incorporated into the biological model to be able to evaluate whether leaping passage would occur. So rather than informing the design, it was more so what is the level of protection provided by the design that was submitted.
All right, this question switches gears here a little bit, this is a great question. Commenter says, not clear if Union Street Dam has been removed or not at this point, but there was 150 public meetings over a 6-year period. What was the watershed moment which garnered support to remove the dam, and who owned Union Street Dam?
So that actually goes a lot longer before our project. The kind of larger scale Boardman restoration project was started probably 10 to 15 years ago, prior to the GLFC's involvement and mentions of FishPass, and that included well north of 150 meetings, and honestly was quite contentious at times because you had a lot of people that were attached to the reservoirs that were created by these dams. But they approached it from a watershed perspective rather than one barrier at a time. So that's where the Army Corps of Engineers was involved in that process and did look into, they did a feasibility analysis on all the, I want to say there was like 100 and some options of what could be done with this system. And what the community decided on through a long process was the removal of those upper 3 dams with modification at Union Street to provide for selective fish passage. Now, that was decided without a solution to how you provide selective fish passage other than, manual trap and transfer of like lake sturgeon, which nobody had a lot of desire to do. So when the GLC became involved with this concept for FishPass, it was really a good matching moment. And in terms of those kind of FishPass specific means, we had a lot of strong support early on. There's still some naysayers that really their issue is about potential use of park space, whether this constitutes a park or not, is where we've hit the most kind of roadblocks. But generally, people are very positive about the project, and so there wasn't really a watershed moment. It's been a part of the community for a long time, and knowing that something was going to happen there. But no, the Union Street Dam has not been removed yet. Its status actually was downgraded in its last safety inspection mid last year. So there's some additional monitoring that's going on right now, but we're hoping that construction can start very soon so that, a new, much more safe structure will be installed shortly.
All right, you kind of mentioned you didn't know what that sorting would look like. So this question is, would it be less expensive to make the barrier impossible to all fish and just collect and transport the desirables?
So that's the current solution right now. And that is used at a couple fishways throughout the Great Lakes to manually trap and sort fish. It's time consuming, it's labor intensive. It can be stressful on fish because they have to be held in tanks for long periods of time before they can be passed. And quite frankly, we think we can do better than that. We may find that the only way to do that is very expensive and not applicable at all sites. And that's an acceptable end result. But, looking at the single stream recycling industry as an analogy, we have a lot of technological power available to us and a long history of tools being tested, relatively smaller scale. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find solutions that work so that manual trap and sort is not the only solution, because certainly you get to bigger systems and larger runs of fish, manual trap and sort can be very problematic. But yeah, that's the current method.
All right, Dan, we are going to have to end things here. We do have about 5 questions that are still lingering. So if those folks who didn't get their questions answered, Dan's contact information is right up here on your last screen. So Dan, would you be okay with people reaching out to ask those final questions to you and through email?
Yep,
all right. Great. Well, thank you, Dan. This has been great. Thanks everyone for listening in. And we hope to see you again at our next one. Until then, may all your recycling be free of food particles and your fish be well sorted. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
All right. Thank you.